Hello, Apramada readers. My name is Ratnaguna, and today I'm going to be talking to a friend of mine, Advayacitta, who's been a member of the Triratna Buddhist order for almost 40 years. He's a clinical psychologist, retired. He's the author of a book, actually, which I read a little while ago, a very interesting book called Thinking at the Crossroads, a Buddhist exploration of Western thought. It's a very, very good book. And one of the things I got from it is Advayacitta's astonishing capacity to read widely, but also think deeply about various issues. I really admire him for that. And today, as I say, we're going to be talking about consciousness and rebirth, and I'm very interested in what he's got to say there. Rebirth for Western Buddhists can be a rather problematical topic because not everyone finds it easy to believe in rebirth. And I think there are probably three options that Western Buddhists take. One is that they simply believe it, either because they've always believed in rebirth or they don't find it hard to believe in it. Secondly, they take an agnostic position. They don't know, how can they tell? So they're open to the idea, especially because the Buddha taught it. So they're Buddhists, so they're open to the idea, but they won't come down one way or the other. And the third option is to simply not believe it, even though the Buddha taught it. So the way they get around that, I think, is by saying, well, the Buddha may have taught rebirth, but it can be understood metaphorically rather than literally, so that every moment is a rebirth, every day is a new rebirth, and so on. So anyway, we're going to talk about rebirth in consciousness today with Advayacitta. And so over to you, Advayacitta. Where do you stand on the topic?
I very much, well, you say believe in rebirth. I take it as the logical position to take, given the evidence. Yeah, and I've long found the scientific, in inverted commas, materialist explanation of consciousness and life to be very lacking, and I started to take rebirth very seriously when I read a paper in a psychiatric journal by a guy called Stevenson. This was back in 1977, where he was talking about the stories of previous lives given by young children. And that made me think, there is some good evidence about the actual existence of rebirth. But long before then, I'd found materialist explanations of the nature of consciousness to be very lacking. They just didn't add up to me. So it's something I've been thinking about for a long, long time. Yeah. And it's actually the sort of logic of it which is most important. But actually, to get one's mind around it all in a logical fashion is very, very difficult. It's a very difficult topic to talk about, to think about, to conceptualize.
There are two things that I want to ask you out of that. The first one is you say there's some evidence. Do scientists accept that evidence? Is it quite strong?
Who do you mean by scientists here, I suppose?
I don't know, those guys in white coats out there.
There, yeah. Well, I'll say that here, we're just widening it out a bit. I think there's two sorts of evidence for rebirth, yes? There's the actual evidence of young children spontaneously talking about a previous life. Yeah. There's also now some supportive evidence, which is of near-death experiences, which have been investigated very scientifically and which cannot be explained by the materialist position, yeah, which we can go into at some point as well. Yeah, and my perception is, although that for a long, long time, the skeptics have been at the forefront, shall we say. The materialists' position has been generally the accepted one. My perception recently is that is beginning to change. There are more and more people out there beginning to say, we think there's evidence that consciousness cannot be reduced to the functionings of the human brain. Yeah. So that, consciousness is not a material thing. And then that, of course, leads to the possibilities of things like rebirth and out-of-the-body experiences.
Yes, it does. Incidentally, my daughter, when she was very young, she seemed to be remembering a previous life. She was expressing certain things that didn't happen in this life. But the people you mentioned, the children that you mentioned who spoke about previous lives, has that been corroborated in any way? Because it could just be a fantasy.
Oh, yes. Well, that's the work of Ian Stevenson, very much. He was a psychiatrist who spent many, many years exploring this stuff, going to places all around the world in different cultures, where he'd heard about children who were speaking similar things and doing as much work as possible to check to see if there was any evidence to support what the children were describing. And the point being, there is often considerable evidence, that the children talk about something which can later be verified. Of course, this is difficult stuff to do. We're not talking so much about scientific investigation here. It's more forensic investigation. Can
you describe the difference between those two?
Forensic is like what happens for a court of law when a detective is taking people's evidence and looking for further evidence to support it or undermine it. So, for example, a child says its name was, say, Fred Smith in a previous life, and Fred Smith actually died, on a ship in the Atlantic. Then the thing to do is go to see if around that time that the child is talking about, as much as you can tell, there was such a ship and somebody called Fred Smith died on it.
I remember watching a TV program many years ago, maybe following Stevenson's book, but I think it was an Indian girl, and she described very clearly a previous life, and they took the girl to where they thought she was talking about, and she remembered, I think, her previous parents, or maybe her children, I can't remember. But when she spoke to them, they kind of recognised each other. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's quite a common occurrence in this sort of research.
And we're talking about consciousness and rebirth. And the other thing I wanted to talk to you more about was you talked earlier about the fact that consciousness cannot be tied down to the physical brain, the body, and you talked about near-death experiences giving some evidence, I think, or suggestions of rebirth. Can you say more about that?
Yes, indeed. Well, the person to read and to study on near-death experiences, I think, is very much Pim van Lommel. He's a Dutch cardiologist who got interested in near-death experiences because some of his patients would have them. And he realized they were very important. And he decided to do some serious scientific study of them. And Pim van Lommel, I think, came from a non-religious background. He just got very interested in these experiences that people were describing. And he realized that people were describing very extraordinary experiences which had been happening when both their heart had stopped and also their brain activity had stopped. So the question for him was, how can people possibly have experience very striking experiences when their brain isn't functioning. Yeah. And that's, if you like, some very direct evidence that consciousness is not dependent on brain functioning.
To a non-scientist like me, that sounds like absolutely watertight evidence that consciousness is not tied to the brain. Is that a naive for you?
Well, the materialists will try and find ways to undermine it. Yeah, I expect they would argue things like, it can't have happened while the brain was not functioning. It must have happened in the short while before it stopped functioning, or maybe when it started functioning again after they were being revived. And Van Lommel goes into those arguments and about that, and doesn't rate them very highly, shall we say? He's fairly sort of critical of them. Yeah, so he's very well worth reading or listening to his talks. I think they're online talks, Pim Van Lommel, because it is a very careful scientific approach. They've taken the trouble to know, that people's hearts have stopped, their nervous system stopped. They've got the evidence for that.
Yes.
And yet, they've also carefully got the evidence of, from what people relate afterwards. Yeah. Not everybody who, for example, has a heart attack, when the heart stops beating, not everybody will report a near-death experience. It tends to be a minority, but a significant minority. Yeah.
I wonder why some report it and some don't.
I don't think anybody knows. I don't think he knows either. Some do, yeah. And there are also, different almost levels of it. Yeah. Some people report a little bit. Some people report various aspects of the near-death experience. Yes. And there's some quite astonishing aspects to it. If I read these accounts, what they remind me of is the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and the Bardo Todol, and what's described in there. Yeah,
maybe you should say a few words about the Tibetan Book of the Dead for any viewers who don't know what that is.
Yeah, it's a Tibetan text about the importance of putting your practice into effect while you're in the process of dying. Yes. And helping somebody, a practitioner, die properly so that they can use the opportunity of being in what's called the in-between state, the bardo, so they can make the best choices in that state. Yeah.
And so if you are one of those Western Buddhists who simply don't and won't believe in rebirth, it's out of court. The Tibetan Book of the Dead presumably has absolutely nothing to say to you.
Well, interesting. Well, I suppose one thing it could say is the importance of practice in this life. Yes.
Yes.
The point being that he emphasizes is the importance of practice, so that you can use what is can be a very positive, very useful opportunity that arises in the process of dying in order to become enlightened. Yes, because as people who have these near-death experiences describe, or some of them describe, there can be an extraordinary experiences that happen during that process, which the Bardo Todol is emphasizing one takes advantage of to make the right choices. Yeah.
Yes. Just returning for a moment to Van Pommel, is that his name?
Pim Van Lommel.
Oh, well, I got that wrong. I I think I know a little bit about him, and I think he said that before he investigated these near-death experiences, he definitely didn't believe in rebirth. Am I remembering that correctly?
I can't remember now precisely what he was. I know he, as he wasn't religious, so he was just investigating because
the reason I mention that is because I find it admirable of him to notice something that his patients are telling him and take it seriously enough to really look into it, and he didn't discard it immediately. Whereas some of the scientists you're mentioning who would, I said to you, do you think scientists would accept that? You said, well, they'd find ways around it. So that suggests that they've made up their mind before they've really investigated it.
Well, yes, I suppose one could say that there is there has been for quite a long time a materialist, I was going to say ideology, but perhaps that's a bit too strong, but a materialist belief system which grew up really from the sort of 19th century onwards. And I understand as a sort of reaction to theism, when people were beginning to give up theism, well, physical sciences were on the rise. So people took physical sciences very seriously. But perhaps they went too far, because physical science can seem to explain the physical world very well. They then jumped from that to assuming there's nothing in the world, in the universe, except the physical world. Yeah, and that's a jump in logic. Yeah.
Yes, it is. It is. Yeah. I remember when I was a young member of the Ratnaguna Buddhist order teaching beginners meditation, that occasionally we'd have scientists coming along, or people have read a paper by a scientist. And in those days, we're talking 40 years ago, there was no interest from science in meditation. It was just gobbledygook, et cetera, et cetera. But now, probably because of the rise of secular mindfulness, scientists are really interested in it, and they say, oh, yeah, it works. And they can see it in the brain. They put these things on people's heads so they can watch brain activity. They say, oh, it really works, yes. But we knew that from our own experience 40 years ago.
Yes. Yeah.
So, now, I know you've got, I reread one of your chapters in your book yesterday, chapter 5, the restricted choice, you called it. And you go into how materialism can't actually explain the existence of consciousness. So can you say something about that for us?
Right. This is where one has to be very logical. Okay.
I will try to follow.
Okay. And one has to sort of clarify what one means by consciousness. Yeah. I mean, consciousness can mean various different things. For this, to explain what it cannot explain, I talk about sense consciousness in particular. And by sense consciousness, I mean the actual phenomena that you experience, the sounds and smells, the visual images that you're experiencing here and now. Yes, all those, yes, sort of visual consciousness, the contents of visual consciousness, of sort of tactile kinesthetic consciousness, and so on. Yeah. And it's important to focus on sense consciousness, because it can take you along the path to realizing that materialism cannot explain it.
Okay? Wow. Okay.
Yeah. In a logical way, you don't have to have evidence of rebirth or near-death experiences. You just sort of realize that that materialism, there comes a point that it can't explain. Yeah, and it's been actually called by a philosopher called David Chalmers the hard problem of consciousness. Yeah, and what I say is, the hard problem of consciousness can never be solved by materialism. Yeah, and the hard well, you've got to understand first of all what sort of sense consciousness actually is, and that's difficult enough in itself, because we seem to have automatic assumptions. For example, that the contents of our sense consciousness, that's the actual visual images I'm experiencing, sounds, etc. We actually automatically go about the world assuming that they're not my images of the world, they're the world itself. Yeah. You know, but if I were to close my eyes, you know, I'd stop having an image of you, but the image on the screen wouldn't have gone out of existence. Yeah, the image of you is still there, I assumed, and Stirananda would be able to tell me that. Yeah, I can't see it because my image is gone, because my eyes were closed. Yeah, so the image is in my stream of consciousness. Are you with me? It's not in the world out there.
I am.
Yep.
Just let me say for the viewers that Stevenanda is your sound engineer, and he's close by. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm following you so far. Yes.
Yeah. So it's important to realise that the contents of sense consciousness are within my sense consciousness. They're not actually the world itself. Though, of course, it's a virtual image of the world, you know, with different dimensions, visual and tactile and so on. Yeah.
So you're not saying that the world outside doesn't exist?
Oh, no. Yeah.
Okay.
But I'm saying my image of it is not the outside world. It's my image of it, and that image exists within my sense consciousness. You with me so far, right?
Yeah, that's easy to understand. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
Well, it's interesting because it gets confusing. Yeah. So there's that. Okay. So the next question arises is, so the materialist will say, well, that image comes about, you know, say a visual image comes about because, well, particles of light are hitting my eyes and getting turned into nerve signals that go up to parts of my brain. Okay. And the materialist will say, that visual image, well, they use expressions that I call the materialist fudge these days. Yeah. Because they're vague. Yeah. That they would go something like this. Yeah. They would say, well, that visual image, it's either got to be part of the functioning of the brain, or it arises because of the functioning of the brain. Yeah. You know, but it's all down to the brain and its brain activity. Okay, that's the sort of explanation. Now, it's a very poor explanation. Yeah.
And you're going to tell us why it's poor in a moment. Okay, good.
That's why I call it the fudge. Yeah. Okay.
So it sounds okay to me. So far, it sounds like, yeah, of course the brain is doing that.
Yeah, but okay. So if I'm, for example, experiencing a pain, yeah, if a neurosurgeon were to somehow look in my brain, would he find the pain? Yeah. Or if I were experiencing a smell, would a sort of smell drift out of my brain that actually parts of my brain have actually turned into a smell? Yeah.
Unlikely.
Well, indeed. Yeah. Or turned into a visual image. But if you're saying that the contents of sense experience are aspects of brain functioning, then take that literally and logically. It means that parts of your brain are turning into those qualia, as they call it. Yeah, literally. But of course they're not. You know, all you do find if you was trying to get inside the brain was lots of patterns of neural activity. Yeah, of particles going in and out of nerve synapses and so on. Yeah. You know, the question is, well, you don't find smells, you don't find colours. Yeah. You don't find sounds there. You just find those patterns of activity. Yeah. So to say that the contents of sense experience are aspects of brain functioning is just nonsense. Yeah.
But let me just challenge you a bit on that, because yet the brain is doing something.
Oh,
So
yes,
the brain
it's
is absolutely essential to this process.
well, near-death experience would say it's not essential some of the time, at least.
Oh, yeah, I've forgotten that.
Yeah. Of course, when we're experiencing our normal waking consciousness, now I'm pretty sure you could find correlations between patterns of brain activity and certain types of sense experience. So if I'm smelling the smell of a rose, I suspect there would be a pattern of brain activity in certain networks of neurons in my brain that correlates with that, that's somehow helping bring that experience into being. And there'll be a different set of neurons involved in bringing out the experience of the color blue, say. I suspect, neuroscience continues its work, it will be able to identify, to some extent, such patterns. But then you're still nowhere near explaining why those patterns bring out, say, a smell or a color. Why should particular pattern of activity in a certain network of brain cells give rise to the experience of a smell, and another pattern give rise to the experience of a sound? That's the hard problem. You've still got a very long way to go to explain it. In fact, you haven't explained it at all. All you're showing is there's a correlation, and that somehow that pattern of activity gives rise to the experience whilst you're in the ordinary waking state. But that's as far as you can go. Why should a particular pattern give rise to a smell rather than a color or whatever, or a pain?
Okay, so apart from those near-death experiences where the brain isn't working, it seems that the experiences we have are in some sense, if not dependent on the brain, they're connected to brain activity. So I suppose what you're going to say is we don't know how that works. That's a hard problem. But is there more to say about that?
Yes. Well, it's important to say a typical logical error that's made is to go from the fact that when we're awake, certain brain activity gives rise to certain types of sense experience. That's one thing to say, but that gets confused with certain type of physical activity is completely responsible for that experience. The analogy I use here is the analogy of say a television. If a television is tuned into a particular broadcasting station, then what appears on the television screen is closely correlated with the activity that's being broadcast by that broadcasting station. However, you do need an independent television set to actually see it. There's an independently existing television set. The activity of the broadcasting company can't bring out of thin air pictures. You've got to have the independently existing television set. Likewise, I say, consciousness can be tuned in to our nervous system, to our brain, and whilst it's tuned in to our brain, what happens in the brain can give rise to aspects of our sense consciousness. But you still need the independently existing sense consciousness mind in order for that to happen.
Okay, so in that analogy, then the television is our Is the television our brain, or is the
television is our mind, our consciousness, including our sense consciousness.
And the broadcaster is the brain?
Is the brain, yeah.
Okay, all
Yep.
right. And then you've got the viewer of the television. Does that come in, or is that taken
well, that takes us to the non-dual nature of sense consciousness, which is a different issue.
Is it too early to go into that? Or
well, it is something that also causes difficulty. It's a difficult thing to think about, yeah, and it goes to the nature of consciousness, the nature of sense consciousness itself. What would you like me to go into it now?
Well, I'd like you to go into it at some point, and partly I should tell viewers that your name actually means non-dual mind, doesn't it?
Yes,
Advayacitta.
it does. Yeah.
So I do want you to talk about it sometime, but there may be other aspects of consciousness and rebirth that you prefer to go into right now. I don't know.
Well, perhaps as we've gone there, I'll go into it. Yes, because it does relate to arguments against the existence of consciousness that have been used by materialists. Yeah, but if we go to the nature of sense consciousness, say the nature of visual consciousness, for example. Yeah. Now, is there anybody, as it were, a sort of inner me that's sort of watching a sort of screen of what's happening in my visual consciousness? Yeah, my visual consciousness is a bit like a screen, a bit like a 3D cinema screen, which is actually made to imitate it. Yeah, but is there a little me, a sort of little numbskull, as it were, if you remember the cartoon creatures?
I do.
Yeah, who's sitting there, sort of separate from the visual consciousness, watching it. Yeah, yeah. The point is, there isn't. Yeah, visual consciousness, you could say, is an aware space. Yeah, in which visual images arise, yeah, but what is observed and the observer are not two separate things, yeah, yeah, non-dual, in other words, not divided, yeah. It's like the sort of nature of consciousness is this sort of non-dual aware space, yeah. That can be an important one to get hold of for all sorts of reasons. Yeah.
Before we go any further, I just want to ask you a question. You said, you can imagine that there's another being like a numbskull watching what's going on, and you said there isn't. That's a strong assertion. How do we know there isn't?
Well, you get to the you get to an argument about infinite regression. If you've got a little numbskull inside watching the visual screen, so does the little numbskull have its own internal processes going on with its own internal images?
Yeah. Like the cover of a Pink Floyd album.
Possibly, yeah.
And then going back and back and back.
Exactly, yeah. And then one in that and one inside. You go on forever, yeah. And actually, a materialist, Daniel Dennett, has used this argument to say there's no such thing as sense consciousness at all, no such things as these internal images, yeah. Because you get to this infinite regress, he argues. There's always got to be somebody who's sitting watching it, and inside them's got to be the same thing, yeah. And I say that you got it wrong, mate. It's the nature of sense consciousness is non-dual, yeah. There isn't a separate observer, yeah. It is like, as it were, an aware space, and of course aspects of Buddhist tradition do talk in these terms about the nature of consciousness, a space of awareness. Yeah.
Yes. So that's it, is it, on that particular topic?
As much as I can think of at the moment.
Okay. So let's see, what else would I like to hear from you? I've gone to that one. Non-dual. I think we've covered most issues, actually. There's maybe one more. You say you've written a few things to me, a few notes. You say there is good evidence of the non-material nature of sense consciousness. Oh, you've covered that, I think, already.
Yeah.
You do say there, in contrast, stories of supposed previous lives obtained under hypnosis are not usually credible. So before I ask you why, I'll just say that I once did a hypnotherapy course. And one of the things that Valerie did, who was leading it, she regressed people back into previous lives.
Yeah.
And I watched her do it with someone, and it was remarkably effective. It was very convincing, because the woman, who's she's just like an ordinary woman, she worked in a bank, she started talking in a very different accent, and she was describing what seemed to be an English village somewhere. It was very convincing, I must say.
Yeah. I think the problem with them is there can be very little supportive evidence, unlike the stories of children. Yeah, and one's got to be aware that, how can I put it, hypnotherapy uses suggestion, and it can be a very powerful thing. Yeah, so somebody can suggest something, and lo and behold, you experience it, shall we say? But it doesn't mean to say it actually happened. Yeah, I think the sort of quality of the evidence in that area, when it's looked at, is poor. There's very little to support, the described previous lives. Yeah, I think there was an investigative journalist, Tom Schroeder, I think it was his name, who wanted to start out looking at that stuff and was very unimpressed. And then he learnt about the work of Ian Stevenson, and for a while accompanied Stevenson around the world on his investigations. And instead of being skeptical, he came to realise the quality of the evidence. Yeah.
My goodness.
In contrast to the other.
Yes. There's one more thing I'd like to ask you about, actually, which is you've shown that actually consciousness is not tied to the brain in the way that materialists say it is. But then there's the issue of rebirth. And is it possible to have a view, or is it possible that it's true that, okay, we agree that consciousness is not an aspect of the brain in the materialist sense, but does that necessarily lead to the belief in rebirth?
Yeah. Well, it doesn't necessarily, yes, because I suppose it could lead logically to all sorts of possibilities. Yeah. But as I say, there is evidence. Which helps. I suppose the other thing is to think about it logically. Is, for example, my physical body is made up of atoms, etc. Yeah. Now, when I physically die, those atoms don't become non-existent. Yeah. My body decays, but the bits of it don't disappear into nothing. Yeah. There is a sort of physical continuity going on. Yeah. You could say sort of likewise, and also when I'm born or when I'm conceived, the physical things that start making up my body don't come from nowhere. They're all pre-existing atoms and things. You could say, well, similarly, dealing with consciousness, perhaps it's sensible to think that consciousness doesn't suddenly arise out of nothing. Yeah, there are pre-existing aspects of consciousness before you were born that come together, shall we say, to be you along with your physical body, and that after death they will continue in some way. That's actually quite logical if you think about it. Yeah, rather than consciousness suddenly coming out of nothing. Yeah, and then disappearing into nothing. Well, how's that happening? Of course, the whole thing, talking about the whole thing, you have to realise that what we know about consciousness, in a way, is minute. This is something extraordinary, actually, when we start thinking about it. Of course, in the West, in particular, the world over now, we've come to understand the physical world much more through science. Yeah, but that doesn't mean to say that we necessarily understand the nature of consciousness one iota.
Yeah, indeed. I have one last question for you, which is at the beginning of the interview, I said, I told the story of talking to you a few days ago, and I said I believe in rebirth, and I thought you gave me a look, suggesting there's more to it than that. So I believe in rebirth because the Buddha taught it.
Yes.
You've obviously got a lot more reasons to believe in it. So would you go so far as to say that you don't believe in rebirth? You're convinced that it's truth because of science, because of logic, and so on.
Convinced. I would put it that I would be very surprised if it wasn't true. Yes, because who knows what evidence one might come across in the future to completely change one's opinion. Yeah, but I would be very surprised. Yeah, very surprised. I think it's logical, and there is evidence to support it. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much, Advayacitta. It's been really, really enjoyable talking to you, and really just give me lots to think about, and I'll follow up some of those leads. Let's just go through them again. The first one was Stevenson, wasn't it? What's his name?
Stevenson, yes.
Any books that one can buy?
There is a book by him. I forget what it's called now. It's quite old. The person to read about Stevenson's work is Jim Tucker, who worked with him. And Jim Tucker's written a book about him. Hang on. Jim, I think, which describes Ian Stevenson's work. It's called Life Before Life.
I've heard of that. I've heard of that book.
And Jim Tucker's also done another book since then, which is about a few specific cases in America called Return to Life. And that's a very good book to read as well. And then there was Lommel, was it, the Dutchman? Pim van Lommel. Yeah.
Lommel. No, I'll never get it right.
Here's the book, Consciousness Beyond Life by Pim van Lommel.
Okay.
Well worth reading. It goes into things in great detail. Pim van Lommel's very interesting. It's a very scientific approach at the beginning, very careful beginning, but later on in the book he starts wondering about what are the implications of this. If consciousness isn't explainable in physical terms, gosh, how can we start thinking about it? And he goes into that. That's also interesting too, as somebody who's not tied to any particular philosophical or religious tradition. He comes up with lots of interesting ideas and looks at different traditions and explanations. Again, it's well worth reading as well. Wonderful.
So thank you again, Advayacitta, for your time.
Right, my pleasure.
And we'll say goodbye now.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye-bye.